So my name is Joshua. This is the Power Recovery YouTube channel, and today we are joined by Steve Taylor, who's a registered dietitian. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. And I just want to start with just if you could just introduce yourself for us, Steve, and just give us a brief background of what led you to pursuing your career in nutrition.
Yeah, basically, as you said, I'm a registered dietitian, and my practice is centered around helping people develop sustainable habits. So, how they eat and then how they exercise. And then basically, what led me here was just kind of I fell in love with lifting and then fell in love with nutrition and kind of started as like a personal pursuit. And then I eventually turned that into a business. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Love that. Love that. Yeah. Is there a particular style of weightlifting that you kind of lean towards more? Is it kind of the Olympic lifting? Is it the bodybuilding? Is it the powerlifting? What's kind of like your go-to form of training?
It would be, I guess you would classify it as like bodybuilding, so more like hypertrophy training. So not, yeah, no, nothing specialized, just on like all the basic barbell, dumbbell, cable, machine exercises. So
Awesome. Awesome. Love that. Love that. Yeah. So in terms of that and Steve, it's actually I don't think I've ever spoken to a dietitian before. So this is going to be quite an interesting conversation. So um, I know in terms of being a dietitian that the training is so intensive in comparison to I was talking to Alan Aragon not too long ago, and compared to like a general practitioner or a physician where it might be a semester of nutrition, the dietitian course must be a lot longer. It's more intensive. It's many more years of nutrition. So, in terms of your actual training, I think I read that you actually received your bachelor's and master's in dietetics, if I'm not mistaken. I just want to kind of know, in terms of your training, how long is actually the dietitian course in America?
so my undergrad was 4 years, and then my master's was an additional two. So basically, like you do your undergrad, you do your master's, and then as you do your master's, you also, or depending on if you want to get your master's, if not, you can do it during your bachelor's. But you also need 1,200, at least 1,200 hours of supervised practice. So during that 1,200 hours, I worked with like a variety of different. I was in a hospital, school district, worked with 3D Muscle Journey, community settings, so all kinds of just kind of bounce around and seeing what different areas of dietetics looks like.
Love that. Yeah. Love that. Yeah. So this is very intensive training. So we're in good hands. So yeah. So I want to start with the nutrition side of things. And I think the main thing for me is I was wondering how you would approach in terms of with a client. I know for a lot of people, the kind of good versus bad food paradigm is a massive, massive issue for a lot of people. It can produce quite a lot of cognitive dissonance to a lot of people. They just can't seem to get past that we could have essentially a variety of different foods. It doesn't have to be necessarily limited to a very small palette of foods. If you were with a client and you noticed they were being overly stressed out about certain foods, or if you noticed there was a lot of distress around incorporating for example, going to a family meal and they were stressing out about this, how would you coach them through incorporating kind of like, I suppose, a more inclusive mindset around food and eating?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different strategies I use for that, just depending on the situation. I guess like mindset wise, it's just trying to get into the idea of looking at the diet as a whole versus like looking at individual foods. So I kind of, it's easier to say something and than to actually like, be able to live it. But like basically I'll say, hey, we'll get your fruit in, your veggies in, your protein, your fiber, and your calories. And as long as you do those things, then, don't stress about all the other, whether you have this or that, you can kind of fill the rest of your diet with what you want. Again, it's easier to say that than to actually live that. And so then with that, it's kind of like, if I can at least get them to give it a go and try it, because normally when people reach out to me, it's they've been trying a variety of things and they haven't been getting the results they want, which is why they're with me. So I'll kind of like remind them of that, like, hey, you reached out because you had tried being super restrictive and like that wasn't working. So what are your thoughts on like we at least try this new style of eating where we are more inclusive? And if you hate it or we have issues, like you can always go back to the more restrictive way because you've done that, you know how that works. So that's typically and then if they are open to trying a more flexible, more inclusive approach, and they start to see results, it makes it then easier to keep doing that. So if I can get them, if they can start having these different foods that they'd cut out previously, and they actually start making progress while they're eating those foods, it makes it easier to keep doing that. And then the other thing, I can tell you right now, like you have something, I don't want to keep cutting you off, but the other thing that I will do is if they have a particular food that they viewed as like quote unquote bad for a long time, I will try to, if possible, like look at that food and point out the qualities in that food that promote health. So like dairy is a big one. Like a lot of people, there's so much negative content around not consuming dairy that I'll point out like, hey, dairy's got high quality protein. It's got B12, it's got calcium, it's got vitamin D, it's got all these different things that are actually very good for us. And so I'll try to take a food like that and point out all the qualities that promote good health.
Yeah, I love that, Steve. Yeah, that's brilliant. That is such a big thing in terms of the dairy phobia. That is one of the more prominent ones in the health and fitness industry. And I love that you'd say that. So you would kind of essentially kind of counterbalance a lot of the maybe possibly the beliefs around the food that might be distressing them, and list the benefits. In terms of it, just kind of a side tangent on that. I wondered in terms of if you're with a client, one of the aspects of nutrition, we always seem to talk about fat loss as the kind of predominant theme in a lot of times with people's health and fitness journey, which is fair to say it's a massive issue for a lot of people, and they usually find it quite difficult regulating their body weight. I wanted to kind of talk about in terms of not necessarily gaining muscle or losing fat, but how would you actually incorporate a client using a maintenance phase? Because it seems this kind of elusive goal for a lot of people. Like it seems a very nebulous goal. You're not moving forwards and necessarily backwards. Would you incorporate something kind of like a weight range, or would it be like a certain calorie range that you would prescribe, or how would you go about doing that with the client?
It's typically a weight range. So like, let's say we go through a fat loss phase and we get to a point where they're happy with where they're at. Then at that point, I'll say, hey, let's try to stay, within 10 pounds of this range or whatever it is, depending on the person. And yeah, I mean, at that point, I'll just try to help them be as flexible as they can be with like basically having to study the least amount of information as possible and still be able to maintain that weight. So if they've been previously weighing every day, let's go to every other day, and then maybe once a week, and then maybe less than that. And if they've been tracking, let's go to 3 days of tracking and then no tracking and get away. So basically, how can they maintain that weight without having to micromanage and study so many details?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I was very interested in that, by the way, because I noticed you had talked about that on a lot of your videos in terms of tracking. I know for myself, I am a little bit more on the quantitative side of things, but I do actually quite enjoy the precision of tracking. And then typically within some form of, if I go into more of a maintenance phase or a gaining phase, I kind of loosen the structure up a little bit where it's not so, like you were saying, then it might be a few days out of the week where I just kind of do a little tally up of calories and macros just to get a good range to see what I might be having on an average day. And if someone is on the extreme side of it, where you notice the client is really tracking things and is finding a very hard time kind of moving away from the structure, what kind of stuff would you prescribe? Would it be just backing away from a few days out of the week, we're going to try and move away from it? Or is there a more gradual progression that you would do, or other kind of things you would focus on instead of tracking, macros or calories?
So typically the way that I'll do it is like, let's say we go through this fat loss phase and they're tracking, and then we get to the end of the fat loss phase, they're ready to transition to maintenance, and they are having anxiety about getting away from tracking. The first thing I'll do is just make sure they have some sort of eating structure set up, so like they're eating at kind of the same times during the, like they have a structure. They're not just kind of like freestyling anymore, but they kind of have when they eat breakfast, when they eat lunch, when they eat dinner. So I'll make sure they have that in place. I will then have them go to just 1 day of not tracking. So they'll still track 6, but they just won't track 1 day. Just like this, the least amount of non-tracking they can do, and just test it out. And for that 1 day they're not tracking, I'll just have them start with a day that's typical for them, where it's just like a normal Monday to Friday. They're working anyway, and they're basically going to be eating the same thing, whether they tracked or didn't track it. And then along with that, I will still have them track their fruit, their servings of fruit, servings of vegetables, and servings of protein consumed. So this way they can make sure they're still getting those things, even though they're not necessarily going to know exactly what their calorie intake is.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Um, I did kind of wonder that. So in terms of say if you were moving away from that structure, it might be kind of like you said, like a progressive thing where you very, very gradually may just come away from it if someone's been intensely tracking for a long period of time. Um, in terms of that, in terms of the structure that you would keep them, would it be mainly, I know you mentioned then about protein, not necessarily calories, but protein, and then maybe the servings of fruits and vegetables. Would that mean you would kind of track the fiber intake possibly as well? In the bracket of that, maybe.
Typically, what I'll do is during that period of tracking, I'll have had them track their fiber, just because since they're going to be tracking everything else, we already have the data for fiber. Typically, when we start getting away from tracking, we might have one last look at fiber before we move away, just to make sure they're getting the adequate intake. But in terms of, like, let's say they're completely away from tracking, I typically don't have people record fiber at that point, just because they don't know exactly where it's at, and it's typically I would do that before they actually transition away.
Yeah. So it sounds like so you would get to the place that is essentially tracking is a kind of a way it almost kind of like self-discovery, understanding like the nutrient values in certain foods, and then by that point where they have that quite thorough understanding of what's in what food, you would pull away a little bit from the tracking if they desire to do that. Um, have you ever, with the client, where you've noticed they might be over tracking things, or they're overly focusing on like food labels, or they're overly focusing on the nutritional values of things, where you've had to possibly like intervene and say, I think this is great that you have this knowledge of certain, having that nutritional awareness of certain foods. Have you ever like intervened and said, I think we need to step away from this just a little bit, just to ease the gas pedal a little bit?
Definitely. Um, Definitely the opposite is more common, where somebody's being too loose with their tracking. Like, they'll go out to eat and they'll just kind of get in MyFitnessPal and type in, cheeseburger, and they'll just pick the first one. So typically it's the opposite, where it's like, hey, we probably need to spend a little bit more time being precise. But there's definitely like the opposite of that, where somebody is, because like tracking itself is not like an issue. It's when somebody is tracking and they're trying to be too perfect, that's when things become a problem, like you just mentioned there. And so if I notice that this tracking is now negatively affecting their life, like they're not going out to eat, or they're starting to be very restrictive, like we talked about, with the foods that they're having, or they won't eat anything that doesn't have a food label, that's when I'll step in and try to start creating some flexibility somewhere, to get them to where they're not trying to be so perfect with their tracking.
Yeah, love that. Love that. Yeah. In terms of like with your clientele, Steve, like, what would you say is one of the hardest things that you've had to work a client through? I don't know if is it just primarily the kind of body composition orientated goals and clients that you work with? Is it powerlifters as well? Is it even people? Have you worked with people with like eating disorders or anything like that? Just out of interest.
That's a very interesting question. I like that. And the first thing that came to my head, because there's so many things, is people who their whole life have been overweight, and they're used to seeing themselves like that. They've always wanted to be leaner, but they've never been leaner, and they have a hard time accepting this new version of themselves. Like, I don't know, it's like, even once it's like, on one hand, like, they believe that it's possible, but on the other hand, it's been 30, 40, 50 years of like seeing themselves a certain way, and like always having these thoughts of like, I need to lose weight, I want to be leaner. That's like, even once they start like losing weight and making progress, and even if people are telling them like, hey, you look so much better, like you look great and all these things, like they sometimes have a hard time accepting that they're actually changing, and they start to sometimes get pulled back into the version of themselves that they have in their head, which is how they've been for, like I said, 40 or 50 years. So that's pretty common, and that's definitely a struggle, is helping people to accept that they are changing, and that they are finally like stepping into this version of themselves that they've always kind of dreamt of.
That's it, bro. Yeah. So yeah, so you were saying how it's kind of like forging this, in a sense, like new identity. It's like a new person in a sense, or revealing what's kind of the newer version of themselves, like you were saying. Um, in terms of that, like when they are doing that massive transition, like you said, if someone's been like that for 30, 40 years, that can't be easy psychologically to really kind of accept these kind of newer habits, I guess. And is there anything that you would kind of go through if someone is like, if you notice they're kind of, I suppose, self-sabotaging themselves, or if you notice they are falling back into old habits, is there anything that you would notice or anything that you would implement to try and keep them back on the straight and narrow with everything?
I'm trying to think. I have like a like a. I don't think I have like a one size fits all for that. It's really, I know a lot of it because like the way my practice works, it's through consultation. So we'll talk one on one, and we'll talk about. I don't know. We'll just kind of talk about that struggle and what's going on, and a lot of times, I don't know. I think it's a lot of times comes down to them recognizing what they're doing and just trying to accept that like they finally are changing, and like the time component helps. Like the more progress someone makes and like the longer they do this thing. So it's like if somebody's struggling at 8 weeks, it's things will be better if I can help them just to stick with this thing when they're 60 weeks down the road. Sometimes it's easier to accept that just once they've kind of lived this new lifestyle for more time. But yeah, I don't know if I have like a one size, like, hey, like everyone, this is like the magic fix for like accepting that like you're finally doing it. I don't think it's that. I think it's a combination of experiences and things, and it's just like I said, I think living this way for a longer period of time and just, I don't know, just sitting down and reflecting and like just accepting like, I am changing. This is possible. Yeah.
But yeah, that's great. So it's kind of like, yeah, you were saying like the kind of time frame component's quite a big thing. If someone's been doing it for 6 weeks versus 60 weeks, the acceptance of the self-efficacy, I would imagine, would be so much higher if they've had more success over a longer period of time. So yeah, that's a good answer. I wanted to ask, in terms of it, I know it's a very controversial topic, but in terms of carbohydrate refeeds, in terms of like how often, how frequent, I know I've had a variety of different answers from people on this. I didn't actually realize how inconclusive a lot of this was with the carbohydrate refeeds. I used to think they were completely necessary. I used to think, you had to do them. It was like a kind of compulsory thing. But it seems like a lot of people are changing their minds on refeeds a lot more recently, that they're not as essential as people have proclaimed them to be, as being kind of like these magical periods in the week where we increase calories and all this magic happens in the body. But I do incorporate them myself, and I've actually just recently done a cut myself. I've lost over 20 pounds, which is good. But yeah, because of all the crazy lockdowns we had and being constantly surrounded by food, I mean, it was a disaster waiting to happen. But luckily, I've actually had quite a successful cut myself. It's actually been the most stress-free cut I think I've ever done. It was just very progressive, very gradual, very minimal cardio, and I did incorporate some form of refeeds. And for me, I think it was more kind of like an adherence thing. It's kind of like a diet checkpoint towards the end of the week where I could just something to look forward to, replenish a bit of glycogen. Could go out with my fiance and have a nice day out with more calories. In terms of your opinion on them, Steve, do you find they are a necessary thing, or do you find that it really depends on the person? Because I know for myself, sometimes one of the things, my only qualm with them is the transitioning from, you're doing 5 days low or 6 days low and then going up and then going back down into diet and calories a little bit, I find quite difficult sometimes, because you want to carry it on. Sometimes I find it stimulates my appetite and stuff like this, going from a high day to a low day. So what are your thoughts on refeeds as a whole?
So I also incorporate like quote unquote like refeeds. I don't necessarily call them that, but so basically my answer might be different than some people's. Is like, so since my whole thing is like helping people develop sustainable habits, I don't, and like we know that as long as calories are controlled, protein and fiber are equated, then the percentage of fat and carbs don't matter as much. So I don't, like when I do like a refeed or a higher day, it's not just through carbohydrates, it's through calories as a whole.
Okay.
again, just because, like I said, as long as calories, protein, and fiber are equated, the fat and carb ratio doesn't matter. So I don't have people stress that detail. And I think regardless of any potential like physiological benefits, just the fact that like it just fits with people's life. Like most people, at least once or twice a week, are gonna want to go out to eat, or like they got like a wedding, or they got something coming up where like they could really use more calories. So that's why I was like outside of any like potential like theoretical benefits, like just from like a sustainability like lifestyle perspective, I include them. Plus, it does, like you said, it gives that psychological break from having to be on. It just gives you that break where you can eat more food. And because I don't have people stress carbs and fats, the transition from a lower calorie day to a higher calorie day really isn't that stressful. I mean, because it's not like they're having to like plan out like I can only have these extra calories through carbs. What is a high carb food that I want to have? It's like, no, you can pick any food you want, just eat a little more food.
Love that. Yeah, I've actually never had anyone explain it like that. I've actually found myself doing that kind of incidentally, like that. I find that not having to push the carbohydrate intake so high, and just having kind of an overall higher calorie day and just equating the calories, it's just so much less stress without obsessing over, trying to get all my carbohydrates through sugar and like weird and wacky stuff to try and get your carbohydrate intake and not impact the other macronutrients. And so that's a really good answer, Steve. I really love that. I was kind of interested in terms of like with your clientele, what is like your ideal client? Who do you really love to work with?
I mean, basically everyone I work with, the goal is to have a better quality of life. So it's like when I first started, I kind of like was open to working with like, I thought about like prepping people for shows and meets and getting people ready for weddings and events. But then I really gravitated towards the people who they just wanted to like feel better. They wanted more energy. They wanted, I don't know, they wanted this to like support the rest of their life. Not like, yeah, that's, so it's like the people who, I don't know, it's fun whenever, and like I'm sure you've seen this as well, as like when somebody goes through this process and you start changing like how you eat and how you exercise, you start to question like the other areas of your life, and it kind of like bleeds over, and like you're like, it makes you start seeing like changes possible here, and you think, okay, well, what can I do with like my career? What can I do with like my relationships? And so it's like, I don't know, the people for where this becomes like a total like lifestyle transformation, like that's definitely like that's definitely my thing.
Love that. Yeah, and it is so true with getting into health and fitness and transforming your body. It has such a massive positive kind of cascading effect on the rest of your life. Why do you think that is, Steve? Like, I know, is it because we learn kind of a template of success with health and fitness, that we have to do it through hard work and studying and being patient, and why do you think that is, that we have this kind of, it has this kind of knock-on domino effect with so many other areas of our life in such a positive way?
I think that's part of it. Definitely, we learn that through hard work, like we can make things happen. And I think a big thing too is we start to learn that like we can like change things. I don't know. I think that becomes a thing. It's like we put an effort into this thing, and then we make progress. And I think that then creates the belief that like I can, if I apply myself, I can like change something. I'm not stuck. And I think that's then what causes us to question other things. If like, because like we weren't happy with our body or like whatever, and then we are able to change that, then we start to question, okay, what's something else I'm not happy with? And like, if I could change this part of my life, like, why couldn't I also change this part?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I suppose it builds that self-efficacy, that confidence that other things in our life are essentially possible. And I suppose as well, I was kind of worrying in terms of being a dietitian. Have you worked any kind of people who've suffered with any kind of form of eating disorders, or you've maybe noticed a client who didn't really previously know may have an eating disorder or anything like that? And if so, do you enjoy working in that side of it as well as the kind of body comp side of it too?
Yeah, I would say a good chunk of my clients do have, because as you know, like disordered eating occurs across the spectrum. Like there's all, it can vary, to like very like mild like behaviors we should probably get rid of to like life threatening. So like a good chunk of the people I work with do have some sort of, and I think most of us who like start this journey develop some like weird things that we should probably drop at some point. But yeah, I do work with a decent amount of people who have had an eating disorder or have some disordered eating behaviors that they want to get rid of. So, and I also enjoy working with them, to your second question, because again, it's still about having a better quality of life. So it's like, these are people who, because I guess I should say, like, to qualify this, like, when I'm working with someone who has an eating disorder or disordered eating behaviors, they are someone who wants to get out of that place. Because, there's that line where somebody doesn't quite yet see that what they're doing is harmful, and they're still wanting to lose more weight, or still wanting to keep doing these things that they really are not serving them, and it's really negatively affecting their life. So it's like, when someone works with me, it's like they've kind of had that aha moments where they realize that what they're doing is not healthy, and they realize the effect that it's having on their life, and they want to get out of that place. And so that I really enjoy.
That's it, bro. Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing. There is a kind of discrepancy, I think, in the health and fitness industry, that most of us who come through it, sometimes when we're first learning about everything, it is a bit overwhelming, and we're kind of following the kind of cliche, broy kind of routines and stuff. And I definitely was one of them as well. I was actually talking to Alan Aragon about this, and he was saying, the kind of poor circulation of information, this kind of relaying of poor information, and not necessarily having, when you first come into this industry, the scientific literacy to really decipher and be discerning towards certain pieces of information. So yeah, I love that, Steve. That's brilliant. I was kind of just wondering, in terms of like a kind of closing message, what would be a massive tip you could maybe give our audience who, they're getting into health and fitness, they're really struggling with the nutrition side of things, in terms of, you were alluding to before, the sustainable habits. What is something that would make most people's habits more sustainable, generally speaking, whether that is their goal is losing fat, gaining muscle, or maintaining?
Probably the mindset as they go through the process. So like, when I start with someone, I'll typically say, like, hey, because again, people who when we start working together, they've tried a variety of things most of the time, and so they're used to, like, they're starting this new thing. It's time to be like restrictive and like cut out all these things and eat all the foods that I think I should be eating. And so basically, I just say, like, hey, try to adopt the mindset of, like, think about how you want to live for the rest of your life, like what you want your life to look like. Like, do you want to travel? Do you want to go out to eat? Do you want to be able to eat food that someone else makes you, and live that way as you go through this process? This way, it's like, once you get to the end, you already have all these strategies for traveling, going out to eat, eating foods that weren't prepped by you, and your life looks exactly the same as the life you want to live long term. And so it's not this big, like, oh shoot, I've been living this way to lose the weight, but that's not actually how I want to live forever. And so now I'm going to change everything at the last minute, but I don't have any strategies for how I actually want to do it. So I'm just like, hey, like, think about how you actually want to spend the rest of your life, and live that way as you go through this process of losing weight.
That's a perfect answer, Steve. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so it's kind of like you were saying, then, living congruently, and if you can't see yourself doing it, 5-6 years from now, then it's probably not in the sense of losing weight, but over a 5-year period. But the habits that come with that, if you can't see it, a few years from now, 5 years from now, then it's probably not worth doing in the long term, and it's going to be short-lived at best. So yeah, I love that, Steve. In terms of people want to get a hold of you, Steve, what's the best way to get a hold of you if someone wants to work with you, if they're really inspired from this interview? How can they get a hold of you, and what's the best way to get in contact?
Yeah. My website's stevetaylorrd.com, and then all my social media is the same thing. So Instagram, Steve Taylor RD, YouTube, Steve Taylor RD, Facebook, Steve Taylor RD. So pretty consistent there.
Awesome, bro. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Steve. I really, really enjoyed that. In terms of any closing messages for our audience, in terms of like the nutrition side, if we just say, just in terms of fat loss, because it is a particular topic which is quite popular amongst the health and fitness community, what is one thing in terms of the fat loss side of things that you would give to help someone lose more weight and sustain it long term?
Probably what I mentioned about the whole mindset as they go through this process. And if I was to add something to that, just the second thing that comes to my head is as you go through this process, like, remember that you're not going to be tracking forever. And so try to get out of tracking what you can while you're doing it. So it's like pay attention to foods, learn about foods, develop your structure, all that stuff with the mindset of knowing like this isn't going to be forever and like this is my time to learn about this stuff. Of course, you're going to keep learning about the stuff even like once you get away, but like that early part where you start tracking and once you go through all that, it's really where you're going to learn a ton that's going to then like help support you the rest of your life.
Love that, Steve. Yeah, it is such a massive thing in terms of like tracking, yeah, the early stages of it anyway, and like you said, trying to progressively maybe come away from it and focus on some form of structure without the severity of overly tracking or overly weighing things. But yeah, it's such a massive learning experience for sure. So thank you so much for your time, Steve. Thank you for today. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and yeah, I'm going to wrap it up there, bro. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Nice one. Thank you, bro.